going on, guys? We're going to do a Q&A. We're going to do these back to back. I haven't looked at the questions beforehand, so I'm just going to react and give you guys my thoughts. That being said, let's get into it. Okay, the best way to build lean mass in terms of lifting. So when it comes to lifting, we need to be aware of a couple variables. Volume and intensity are the biggest ones, and then we also need to make sure that we're recovering properly and getting adequate nutrition and sleep. So when it comes to nutrition, it's being in a caloric surplus is the most important variable. You're not going to gain weight if you're not in a consistent caloric surplus. This means eating more calories than you're burning. The second most important piece of nutritional information after calories is the composition of those calories. So the macronutrient breakdown, protein, carbohydrates, and fats. You're going to want to be in a relatively balanced macronutrient breakdown, somewhere around 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. You could get away with a little bit less than that when you're trying to gain weight, but that's a good rule of thumb. Somewhere around 20 to 25% of your overall calories from fat, and then the rest from carbs. Carbs are your main energy source, and again, those are going to help give you energy in your lifting and training sessions, and also help with recovery. So by far, that's the most important piece of gaining muscle mass. The other important consideration is that if you try to gain weight too fast, you're going to be gaining weight, but a lot of that's going to be fat mass. So depending on your level of advancement, the further away you are from your genetic potential, the quicker you can gain weight, the quicker you can add size, all else being equal. So a kid who's 6'5", maybe 150 pounds, 160 pounds, he's going to be able to put on 1.5, maybe 2 pounds a week, and the vast majority of that is going to be lean mass because he's so far away from his genetic potential, 50, 60, 70 pounds away from where he needs to be. Somebody who's maybe 5'10", 195 pounds, they've already been training for a few years. You can't just try and go and gain 2 pounds a week. The vast majority of that's going to be fat mass. So the way we break it up in the ebook is based on your training age and your training status. So somewhere around 1 to 1.5, definitely no more than 2 pounds a week for more of your novice athletes who are really far from their genetic potential. And then something like 0.5 pounds a week, maybe up to about 2 or 3 pounds a month for somebody who's relatively intermediate, has a strength base, and they're just trying to add a little bit of lean muscle mass. It's also important to understand that you're going to gain some fat mass no matter what you do. Yes, that fat mass is going to be a lot lower proportion the more of a novice you are, and also depending on some genetic factors. Me, for example, from about 150, 155 pounds to about 185, 190, I gained absolutely no noticeable amount of fat during that time period. But from then on to get from 190 or so to maybe 215, there was definitely a significant percentage of that weight gain that was fat at that point. So it's going to be different for everybody as far as the proportions. Lifting wise, just know that volume is a key piece of gaining lean mass. You're going to have trouble gaining mass if your workouts are something like 3 sets of 3 deadlifts. That's only 9 total working reps. Something like 4 sets of 6, 3 sets of 8, 4 sets of 10. Something where it gives you enough volume, enough total reps above a certain threshold is going to be important when it comes to giving yourself the volume over a certain intensity threshold to actually gain size. That being said, you shouldn't be training at too high of an intensity. Anything over 90% isn't necessarily the best range to be working in from a hypertrophy or a lean mass standpoint. That's more absolute strength. And then if you're too low of an intensity, if you're, let's say, under 50, 60% of your 1 rep max, and you're doing sets of 15, sets of 20, 25, that's not necessarily going to be ideal either. You're training more in the muscular endurance range there. So somewhere in the 5 to 10 or 5 to 12 rep range, and 3 to 5 sets is a good gauge for each muscle group. Okay, how can I increase rotation of the ball? This isn't something that I've spent a lot of time experimenting with myself. We still don't know a ton about exactly how to increase spin rate. We do know that foreign substances can increase spin rate, from pine tar to bullfrog and rosin. That's been verified that can increase spin rate. So we do know that. I do have several anecdotes of pro pitchers who basically tried to snap their wrist more aggressively into ball release, and that created a noticeable 200 to 300 RPM increase for a couple of these guys. So at this point, it's more anecdotes. We don't necessarily know exactly how to train spin rate. At least I'm not aware of anybody that's completely figured this out. So again, it's more, if you have a Rapsodo or some way to test and track spin rate, there's a lot of different variables that go into it. You can just kind of play around with pitch grips, play around with your wrist action into ball release, and just kind of see what works for you. But again, it's not all about spin rate. There's definitely big leaguers that are successful at the lower spin rate ranges, sinker baller guys, and there's obviously big leaguers successful at the top end of that range. What you really want to avoid being is in that middle range. That's where hitters tend to tee off. Thoughts on 2-knee long toss for upper half optimization. So this is the classic Craig Kimbrell story. He broke his ankle or his foot, whatever it was, and basically long toss from his knees until he rehabbed that, and that was how he got his 5-10 mile an hour velocity bump. There is a lot of truth and validity to improving arm action, improving the end of the kinetic chain. It doesn't necessarily have to be from a 2-knee drill. It doesn't necessarily have to be from long toss. Something like a pivot pickoff, a 10 toes drill, any sort of upper half arm action isolation drill. If you do have an upper half or arm action deficiency, is going to help. If you can transfer that, it's going to benefit the rest of your delivery by improving that end piece of the kinetic chain. So long toss is just a drill. You don't have to throw on an uphill arc to get the benefits out of arm action drills. I like long toss for a lot of guys because you get the immediate feedback from being able to see how far the ball went, being able to see if that ball cut or ran 30 yards. So long toss is a good drill to work on that, but it's not 100% necessary. And then again, 2-knee, again, that's just taking the lower half out of it. You can still do that with a pivot pickoff, a 10 toes drill, a feet and sand drill, anything that takes the hips and the lower half out of it and focuses on the arm action. From there, it's not as simple as just getting good at a given drill. You need to be able to backwards chain your way and incorporate shoulder rotation, incorporate the hips, incorporate linear momentum, the lower half, a leg lift. You need to be able to work from getting good at that drill and to meld that and merge that into the rest of your throw. So that's the important piece. Just going from 50 yard to 100 yard 2-knee long toss doesn't mean you're going to just gain 10 miles an hour in your delivery. You need to be able to transfer that to your actual motion. How to build muscle efficiently for a skinny 17-year-old. So we already kind of touched on this. We touched on nutrition, training. I would make sure, just 2 other notes. You have to be sleeping. If you're not sleeping 8, 9, 10 hours, you're just going to be shooting yourself in the foot a little bit from a recovery standpoint. It's not really about how hard you can push yourself in the weight room. You're not going to gain muscle in the weight room. That's where you break down the muscle. That's the training stimulus. From there, you actually need to recover. You're building muscle when you sleep, you're building muscle when you recover, you're building muscle in between your workouts. So just keep that in mind. What allows for smaller guys under 6 feet to throw 96 miles per hour plus, healthily and consistently? It's no different for guys under 6 feet than guys over 6 feet. The whole point is to figure out what are all the variables that go into throwing hard, staying healthy, moving properly at each joint in your body, and how can we check as many of those off the list as possible in training our pitchers and training our athletes. So whether that's a ankle mobility restriction that this particular pitcher has that's affecting the rest of his throw, the rest of his kinetic chain, or it's a mobility issue in his scapula, in his shoulder complex that's affecting his arm's ability to lay back properly and distribute that stress properly throughout the throw, or maybe he's got a pushing arm action, maybe he's missing thoracic rotation, he's missing segmentation from his hips to his upper body. You need to be able to have the structure in place to then elicit the proper patterns and the proper energy transfer into the ball. That being said, there is no one has figured out at this point how to throw 96 plus healthy for 20 plus years. If any MLB team had figured that out, we wouldn't be seeing 30, 40, 50% of big leaguers having had Tommy John surgery, wouldn't be seeing such massive injury rates. So nobody has completely figured out this equation. All we can do is try to figure out how do the most efficient pitchers in the world move. How can we replicate that for a given athlete's body structure? In other words, we have a 5'10" athlete who comes to us trying to figure out how to throw harder. We're not going to compare him to Randy Johnson. We're going to compare him to the 5'8" to 6 foot pitchers who throw 96 plus and are relatively injury-free in the big leagues. And we're going to see what are the similarities, what are the differences between those athletes, where are their mobility limitations in his kinetic chain, where are their energy leaks in his throw, and then from there it's workload management. It's not being an idiot. Obviously, it's not going way too aggressive in training, throwing completely year-round, and not taking any time off from high-intensity throwing. There's a lot of variables that go into staying healthy, and nobody's completely figured it out at this point. How often do you train for speed? I'm guessing this is a question for pitchers based on speed and conditioning. It could mean velocity-based training or power training. I'm going to take it to mean speed and conditioning. Most of our pitchers, we train twice a week, some sort of speed and conditioning. One of those is a little bit more aerobic base, and one of those is some sort of short distance sprint work or prowler pushes or stair sprints or bike intervals, something like that. So when it comes to speed and conditioning for pitchers, I kind of view that in the same lens as when we talk about nutrition and supplements. It's that very last maybe 1, 2, 3% of what goes into the total body preparation. So we aren't necessarily placing a huge emphasis on speed and conditioning. I don't believe a pitcher has to be able to run a certain 60 time or sprint every single day, 7 days a week to get a training effect or to repeat their throwing delivery or to maintain their athleticism or to throw hard. So I think it's a little bit overrated. There is some place for having a general aerobic base as far as recovery goes, and then there's some place for being able to run 5 sprints without pulling a hamstring and being able to do that as well. So about twice a week is the answer. How to accomplish a similar build to a javelin thrower while remaining mobile. So first thing to notice is that when we're talking about javelin throwers, most of these guys that we're looking at on a daily basis, we're talking about the top 5, 10 throwers in the entire world. So we're looking at the genetic elite. And even with looking at the genetic elite, guys like Johannes Vetter, there is a very wide range of body types that we see. Thomas Roller, for example, and Johannes Vetter, very, very similar in the end result that they're able to get, but 2 completely different body types. So again, asking how to create a similar build to a javelin thrower, to me that's no different than asking how to create a similar build to a 95-mile-an-hour thrower. There's a wide array of athletes. You're typically going to see guys are over 6 feet, although that's not a prerequisite. You're going to see over 190 pounds. Guys who are over 200 pounds, slightly higher body fat percentage, and the guys who are closer to 190, they're very, very lean. So what that tells you is relatively high level of lean body mass, high amount of muscle mass, but it's not only about that. Thomas Roller doesn't have, he's not a bodybuilder type guy. He doesn't have a huge amount of muscle mass. He can't squat 500 pounds. He's a very springy, elastic athlete. Johannes Vetter, he's more of the gorilla type of athlete. He's kind of brute force, high muscle mass, very high strength levels. So there's different ways to get the job done, but also realize that when it comes to javelin, we're talking about a much heavier implement. I think a javelin is roughly 1 pound. I could be wrong on that. So we're talking about a heavier implement. So when we look at the strength-speed continuum, javelin is more on that strength end of the continuum than a 5-ounce baseball. So the optimal athlete for throwing a javelin well is going to be lean. They're going to be fast to be able to utilize that run-up. And they're also going to be they're going to value strength more than the elastic and speed side of the continuum because they're throwing a heavier implement. So again, to me, this isn't any different than asking how to create a similar build to a 95-mile-an-hour thrower. We're trying to build a base of strength, which requires building a base of lean body mass. We're trying to optimize our body composition. And while that's not as important for pitchers, somewhere in the 12 to 15% body fat range is probably where you want to be. And for javelin, you probably want to be a little bit below that because there is a sprinting component to the event. Is upper body tilt bad for a pitcher? If you're talking about shoulder tilt during the drive phase, as far as creating lateral tilt back towards second base during the drive phase, it can be good and it can be bad. So one athlete that we trained, Andrew Owen, he went from 88-91 touching 92 to 94-96 in bullpens. And with him, one of the main things we did, he was just very upright in his delivery. There wasn't much lateral use of his back leg, and he didn't create any sort of lateral move off the rear leg, so there was no shoulder tilt being created. The problem arises when pitchers artificially lean back to try to create shoulder tilt. They get to a balance point, and then their next move is to just artificially lean the shoulders back and then drive. The shoulder tilt should be an equal and opposite result of creating a good shift of their center of mass and then driving with their back leg. As the back leg creates a horizontal force vector, the shoulders tilt as a counter response to that. So shoulder tilt is a response to the back leg driving horizontally after a good weight shift. It's not an artificial leaning back of the shoulder and just dipping the shoulder. If you do that, it's going to be really hard to actually get your shoulders level at landing and get back over top of the ball. How to cue hip-shoulder separation. This is something I struggled with for a long time. I think it's a little bit different for everybody, depending on what it takes for their body, their system to feel those positions and feel that segmentation between the hips and the lower half. One thing we need to understand about hip-shoulder separation is it's not simply a transverse plane thing. It's not simply lateral. So it's not simply the hips rotating and the shoulders counter-rotating. There's a frontal plane component to it as well. So as the hips rotate, it's not just pure rotation, it's also tilt. So as a lefty thrower, the pelvis tilts up and then it's a counter rotation backwards, but also a lateral tilt as well. So that rotation is happening in 2 planes at once. So that's the first thing about hip-shoulder separation. You have to be able to utilize the lateral lines in your body and also the rotational aspect as well. For me, I really learned it. The breakthrough for me was using the roll-in or torque drill, as it was called by the Texas Baseball Ranch initially, where I would kind of, and I didn't even know what this drill was. I just kind of made up a similar drill on my own. I was going into my senior year of college. I was tired of knowing that I could throw in the 90s and not being able to consistently. So I basically locked my pelvis forward, locked my back foot forward. I would counter rotate my shoulders as far as they would go, and from there I would step and throw. That's how I taught myself how to separate. I've since learned that's not necessarily the most efficient way to transfer energy, but for me, I was 10, 15 plus years of doing it improperly, just flying open with the front shoulder. That was kind of my way of just shocking my system and learning to feel some positions statically and dynamically that I'd never felt before. I don't think that most athletes would benefit from that as much as I did, because I have very good hip internal rotation, so I could kind of force my back foot in that position. I have very good thoracic rotation, so I could force my upper half in that position. But again, I've dealt with some mobility issues, some imbalances. My T-spine started to become a little bit torqued to my glove side. Started to get some tibia mobility adaptations from doing that, where I have slightly internally rotated tibia on my rear leg. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying to force some of these positions, but roll-ins and flowing through it naturally can really help. Just make sure that you're also matching the way that you're doing your drills and your drill work to your specific anatomy and your specific mobility limitations. I just did a presentation where we talked about, and there's an article you can check out on the website as well. We talk about how every athlete has different hip anatomy. The one end we have anteverted athletes, and what that means is your bony structure makes it really easy to get internal rotation of your hip. So roll-ins for me were very, very easy. And then those same athletes, like myself, struggle to get a ton of hip external rotation. So throwing with, let's say, a vertical shin angle and a really externally rotated position like Carson Fulmer or Justin Verlander, that's a struggle for me. I actually get a pinch in my hip if I overdo that position and try to replicate that. And then you have athletes on the other end. They struggle to get hip internal rotation. They've got very good hip external. And if you try to force them into a roll-in or internally rotated position, they just tank in velo. And they aren't able to get into those positions. So it's about finding the specific drill progressions for you that allows you to feel the segmentation between your hips and your shoulders. And again, that's going to be different for everybody. Running at the beach, does it helps? We might skip this one. I think we're going to skip that one. In a young age, would you prefer to throw hard or throw more strikes? So I'm actually going to say neither one is the main goal at a young age. At a young age, the goal is that we're teaching good movement patterns and we're teaching athleticism. We're teaching body awareness. We're teaching athletes how to move in a variety of movement patterns and drills and positions and sports, and just teaching them to be athletes at that age. That being said, if they have good movement patterns and you are cueing, you should be cueing them to throw the crap out of the ball on a regular basis, within reason, within reasonable workloads. The body does have a certain degree of self-organization. If you're teaching, a young shortstop, outfielder, catcher to throw the crap out of the ball and use efficient patterns, they're typically going to throw hard just as a byproduct of having good patterns, good mobility, and moving properly. But it shouldn't be about radar gunning a 10-year-old and trying to max out, pull downs or anything like that. It's about creating good body awareness, good athleticism, general strength base as far as being able to manipulate their body weight, do a push-up. They should be able to do an inverted row. They should be able to do a hip hinge and a body weight squat, maybe add a little bit of weight, 10, 20% of their body weight to that. But again, they're not going to be able to build a huge degree of muscle mass before they've hit puberty. 15 to 18. Okay, so this isn't completely young athletes, but before that age, they're not going to be able to build a huge degree of muscle mass before then. So it's again more about body awareness. Once they do hit puberty, then it's about slowly progressing them under good movement quality. So building up a squat pattern, building up a deadlift pattern, building up a horizontal and vertical rowing and pressing patterns, and then we're loading good biomechanics. So the way that we approach training, once they do get to lifting age here, is that we're trying to reinforce good biomechanics. Everything that we're doing, it's not about building muscle mass. It's not about building force output. Those are all byproducts of loading good patterns. So we can load a good squatting pattern, a good hip hinging pattern, and slowly progress those intelligently with perfect form. That's how we enhance athleticism, not just build strength. Strength is going to come as a byproduct of that. That being said, if we are talking about the top end of this range, 18-year-olds, 17-year-olds, and they are obviously trying to play in college, that's their main goal, you're going to get more looks throwing hard, period. That's how it is. Those are where the scholarships go. At the college level, that's where the guys that get drafted and the signing bonuses, that's where they give them. So we all know this. We all know that's how the system works. I'm just, I'm not saying I'm for or against that. I'm just saying that's how the system works. So if you think that just because you throw 82 and you're putting up good numbers and you're throwing strikes, you're going to get some opportunities, you're going to be fighting a little bit of an uphill battle if you play completely against the way the system's set up at this point. How much time off from summer and fall, and how to make mechanical adjustments during that time? This is a good question. The way we approach it, it's kind of variable depending on the kid's age and the kid's specific situation. If we're talking about an athlete who maybe just had a very high workload in the spring and summer, especially if they're having symptoms, fatigue symptoms, or if they're having any sort of performance decrease towards the end of the summer, maybe their velocity's dropped or they lost 10 pounds and they're starting to struggle performance-wise, then we might err a little bit more on the side of caution, and it might be something like a 12-week, a full 3-month down period from any throwing at all, and then a full 4-week on-ramp period, where at the end of that they're starting to get back into hard throwing. So 4 months completely off from any hard throwing, and then we might see something, we might be a little more aggressive if we're at specific inflection points in an athlete's career. So let's say a 17-year-old rising high school senior who's throwing 78 miles an hour, and they need to be 85. They know they need to be 84, 85 to have a chance of playing in college or their career's over. Well, we're at a scenario where if you just take 4 months off for that kid, you're basically just throwing in the towel on that kid's career, because he needs to be able to throw. He needs to be able to make some pretty extreme improvements in a very short time frame. He's got 6 months till the season, and you just throw in the towel for 4 months of that. Not that you wouldn't be doing lifting or other training, but you need to be able to roll the dice a little bit within reason, depending on the athlete's situation. So somebody like that, maybe they didn't play summer ball, maybe they only threw 10 innings for their high school team, and maybe they need to gain 7 miles an hour or their career's over. We might not take any time off for them. We might take some time away from hard throwing and still work on mechanical patterning at lower efforts. The other thing that we make very clear to our guys is that it's not just about high intent throwing to gain velocity. Most of the velocity that our guys gain from a throwing standpoint is from the patterning work that they're doing. It's becoming a more efficient thrower. It's transferring energy more efficiently from the ground up. It's transferring more energy more efficiently from the hips through the shoulders, through the entire kinetic chain. The intent aspect is that very final icing on the cake. That's that last 2 to 3 miles an hour that you know is going to be there when you pound some caffeine, when the scout day shows up, when the lights turn on. That's the last 2 to 3 miles an hour. We shouldn't be relying on those things in training to get the velocity increase. Those are going to be there, but we need to be much more aware of the fact that this is a patterning issue and a energy transfer issue than an adrenaline and brute forcing issue. As far as making mechanical adjustments during time completely off from throwing, it's a little hard to do if you completely ignore throwing altogether. Unless you have some sort of major mechanical or mobility block, rather, tissue block that's stopping you from getting in good positions. If you've got a major, let's say major mobility issue through your upper half, maybe a pec minor or subclavius issue stopping your arm from actually getting back when you throw, then yeah, maybe you take 2 months off or 4 weeks off to simply focus on that, before knowing that your throwing is essentially being wasted and you're just reinforcing bad patterns in your arm. So if there's a specific plan for addressing an issue that you know exactly how it's affecting your mechanics negatively, then yeah, that can make sense to take some time off to specifically focus on that. But yeah, generally anywhere from no time off to 3 to 4 months off is kind of the range. It obviously depends on the specific situation. Advice for guys that have to hang up the cleats soon and move on from playing the game. I'm guessing this is a guy who maybe played professionally and knows he's about to get released, or a college guy who knows he's not going to get drafted. It's tough, man. I mean, I know guys who've made a smooth transition out of it and just kind of begin to enjoy all the things in life that they were kind of giving up during their career. I'm sure a lot of you guys follow Eric Sim on social media, but he's a guy who, he played 5 to 7 years of minor league ball, and he says he doesn't miss it at all, and he basically started to realize what he was missing out on through college baseball and through professional baseball. So basically starting to look at the positives, look at everything that you can do that you haven't been able to do. I know me personally, I've never skied, snowboarded, any of this stuff, because basically since the time I decided I wanted to play baseball at high level, I've kind of avoided anything that would put me at unnecessary risk. So there's all sorts of things that I'm gonna do, from a training standpoint, from a just life standpoint once my career's over. And then I know guys who it's just very tough. It's an identity crisis because it's something they've done their entire life, and it just ends. And there's just kind of a hole there, and you have to find something to fill it. A lot of guys fill it with coaching and helping other players get to where they want to go. Finding a hobby, spending more time with your family, whatever that means for you. I think you need to find something to give you meaning and purpose and value, because I know for me at least, training in baseball has kind of been a guiding purpose, waking up every day. And I've, now pairing that with coaching can help use my knowledge and skills and everything to help guys get to the same point. So again, I think you need to find a purpose, you need to find some way to give back and some other passion. Maybe it's a related passion, maybe you're still within the baseball industry, but it's something that you can do moving forward that gives you purpose when you wake up. Best things you can do to help gain weight. We already touched on this a little bit, but nutrition-wise, one helpful tip is just focusing on very calorically dense things. When I'm trying to lose weight versus gaining weight, the total volume of food I'm eating really doesn't change much. A lot of people are surprised by that. They think you have to be force-feeding yourself to eat 4,000 calories a day. But for me, kind of a typical maintenance, maybe that's 3,200, 3,500 calories a day. The only thing I really change when I'm trying to gain weight is I'll change the composition of the food I'm eating. It's less chicken breast, tuna fish, lean meat. It's more fattier cuts of meat, more red meat, more pork, ground beef, maybe 85–90% lean ground beef instead of 96% lean ground beef, more steak, whole milk instead of fat-free milk. So it's just changing the composition of some of the foods I'm already eating. 120 calorie per slice bread instead of 40 calorie per slice bread if I was trying to lose weight. More peanut butter, more high-fat foods. So caloric density helps a lot when it comes to gaining weight without feeling like you're having to force feed yourself. As a JUCO athlete on a limited budget, how would you invest in development? I would invest in your knowledge, first and foremost. I would invest in trying to figure out what you're doing right now, training-wise, throwing-wise, career-wise, and what you need to do to bridge the gap. Knowledge tends to be the biggest limiting factor for most athletes. They don't know what their flaws are. They don't have a plan for fixing that, and they're spending money on irrelevant things. They're spending money on whatever pre-workout supplement. They're spending $40 a month on pre-workout, but they're not hitting their calories. They have no plan for tracking anything. They don't have a real throwing program. They don't know what their mechanical flaws are. I would say getting an assessment from somebody who knows what they're looking for and educating yourself. I'd say that would probably be the biggest bang for your buck if you had 50 or 100 bucks a month to spend on it, is informational resources and getting in touch with the right people who can give you some sort of plan. Okay, so how to lose body fat and lower body fat percentage, and not just lose overall weight in general. So this is very similar to the answer about how to gain weight properly and not gain body fat. It's doing it slowly and intelligently. So typically we want to be in roughly the 1 to 1.5 pounds of weight loss per week. Guys typically fall into trouble when they try to get 3, 4, 5 pounds a week. They see that the weight's coming off and they think, okay, if 3, 4 pounds is good, 5, 6 pounds a week is better, and they see that they're able to control the variables and create the change and the effect on their body weight. So they just think more is better. Like this is the CC Sabathia example when he went, I can't remember, I think he went vegan or vegetarian, or he tried to lose weight. He lost 40 pounds real quick. Velo dropped and he just decided it wasn't for him. So what actually happened is he lost a lot of lean body mass, what it sounds like, and he was in such an extreme caloric deficit that he had no energy, had no training energy, and he had an acute strength loss in that short term. So very common when guys don't do it properly and they try to lose weight too aggressively. If you stick to roughly a 500 to 700 calorie deficit on a weekly basis, you should feel good. You shouldn't really feel like you're dieting, and you should be losing about 1 to 1.5 pounds a week if you're calculating the numbers right. So as an example, let's say you're at 3,000 calories a day is your maintenance. you might start with 2,600 calories a day for weight loss, and you're still going to be lifting hard. You're not going to be killing yourself, but you're still lifting hard. You're still handling weight. And the second you start to notice your strength numbers drop off at all, or your energy levels start to tank, you can do what's called a refeed, which is basically taking a day and eating in a calorie maintenance or a slight calorie surplus for that training day. So as an example, you're 2,600, 2,600, 2,600. 3 weeks in, you start to feel like crap. Your energy just tanks. You might eat 3,000 or 3,500 calories for that one day. The next day, you're going to feel great. You've just topped off your glycogen stores, your stored carbohydrate, and then from there, you basically just keep on going. Occasionally, guys will get a little burnout, and you'll need to take them out of the cut for 1 or 2 weeks before continuing. But essentially, it's just slowly chipping away, a pound a week, slight refeed when you need it, slowly chipping away a pound a week, and then you just continue that process. It's not something I would do in season when you're trying to perform at your absolute peak and recover at your absolute peak. But again, you shouldn't really be risking muscle mass if you're doing it right. You shouldn't notice your strength tanking off. You're probably not going to increase strength, but you shouldn't notice it dropping at all if you're doing it right, because most of our guys that we would have cut, we're not cutting in single digit body fat. We're cutting from 25% body fat to 15% or 18% body fat to 12%. We're cutting in ranges where you shouldn't be sacrificing muscle mass if you're doing it properly. And then the other thing is, obviously, caloric balance is important, but from a macronutrient standpoint, you want to make sure you keep that protein very high, over 1 gram per pound of body weight. It's the most satiating nutrient, most filling nutrient. It's also, we can link a study in the description. Protein is actually effectively roughly 3 calories per gram, even though it's listed as 4 calories per gram. When you take into effect what's called the thermogenic effect of food for protein, it's actually closer to 3 calories per gram. Fat is 9 calories per gram. Carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram. Protein, actually, there's an argument to be made that it should be listed as 3 calories per gram because of that. So it's very filling. It's also less calorically dense, and it also will help you retain muscle mass. Because as you get into a calorie deficit, you just want to make sure that your body's not dipping into its stored protein for its protein needs, which is your muscle mass, and it's getting that from exogenous sources of protein, which is the protein that you're bringing in from the outside into your body. So somewhere around 30 to 40% of your intake from protein, or over 1 gram per pound of body weight. And then you still need a base amount of fat. You don't want to drop your fat too low for hormonal reasons. Testosterone production can drop if you go completely almost no fat diet. And then keep your carbs as high as you can. As you need to drop your calories a little bit lower, drop those from the carbohydrate intake, not from the fat or protein intake. Physicality, genetics, and strength aside, who do you believe has the best mechanics? This is a tough one. I don't think there's such a thing as perfect mechanics. I think there is such a thing as very efficient mechanics. If you were going to ask me who has a 10 out of 10 efficiency mechanics, I'm sure I could list out several dozen guys in the big leagues. I love Marcus Stroman's delivery. I love Tim Lincecum's delivery when he was in college with as efficient a weight shift as he had. I love Tim Collins' delivery. Basically, any smaller or skinnier pitcher who throws into the upper 90s has got to move extremely efficiently and and transfer energy extremely well. So any of those guys would probably be my bet as far as 10 out of 10 efficiency. But I don't think you can necessarily rank from there who is the most efficient mechanics, because it's so dependent on your specific limb lengths, anthropometry, height, levers, all that stuff comes into play from there. Cues for keeping the front side in and not flying open. So for me, one of my favorite cues is getting a little bit of an internal rotation torque on the glove side as you drive towards the plate. And what that means is, if a lot of guys, their glove side tends to be linked to the front side flying open, and they tend to not be able to create any sort of stiffness or stability on that glove side to pull against. So they'll tend to be a little bit more supinated with the glove arm and externally rotated as they go through their arm action. So adding a little bit of an internal rotation torque on that glove arm, you can think about it as pointing that palm to the sky. So getting in this position right here, you basically can't fly open the front shoulder if you're able to keep that position a little bit longer. I learned this from Luke Haggerty, who I believe, I want to say Tom Seaver's pitching coach. He learned it in pro ball, and that was a cue that helped me, and I've used it with a number of my guys, and it really helps them stay closed. It doesn't work for everybody, and how everybody's upper half time's up, but I would give that one a try. Is thinking internal rotation torque with the glove shoulder and thinking palm to the sky as you break your hands. That can really help that unwinding process and get the glove arm in the proper plane versus just spinning open with the glove side. What's your opinion on, for pitchers, back leg drive and vertical shin? We touched on this a little bit. I wrote an article on this several months ago, but it's going to be dependent on your specific structure and what works best for you. Somebody who is much more anteverted, they're good at internal rotation of the back hip. They might struggle, or in my case, might not be able to do that vertical shin position because you have a bony block in the way that your hips work and move. Whereas somebody like a Tim Collins or a Marcus Stroman or Verlander or Carson Fulmer, they have that range in full hip external rotation, and for them, potentially, if you put them in an internally rotated position, their hip isn't in a range that it can produce as much force and continue to stay in contact through that healing glute with the rubber. So, point being, it depends. It's something that I think from the majority of pitchers is a good idea, but you're going to find guys like myself where they can't get in that true vertical shin position. The commonality between the different hip types is that we're still trying to maintain ground contact with the back heel and through the back glute, so that we can drive through our center of mass as long as possible. So that's the commonality. It's just how we get there, and that depends on your hip structure. What do you think separates Tread from other facilities? I'm not going to get into this too much. Obviously they've had a lot of success with their athletes. I think one thing that we really try to emphasize with our coaches is continuing to train and do and practice this stuff on a daily basis. I'm still throwing, training, working through different mobility issues, injury issues that I've had in the past. All our coaches are still doing this on a daily basis, and we require that from our coaches because you can't coach somebody how to do something effectively if you don't know what it feels like, you've never done it yourself, and you're not continuing to learn and educate yourself on a daily basis. So we are continually doing all these things, experimenting, trying stuff on ourselves, and because pitching and throwing is not just a science, it's such an art and feel-based as well. Changing movement, communicating, especially in a remote capacity, and communicating these feels, you really have to have felt it and done it yourself to appreciate some of these intricacies. What do they mean by keeping your torso stacked in the pitching delivery? So stacked torso basically just means not letting your hips get out from underneath you, not leaning way too far back or way too far forward, or leaning way too far back or leaning way too far forward. It's keeping your pelvis underneath you and stacked, just like if you were throwing a punch. You wouldn't throw a punch from out front, you wouldn't throw a punch from back here or out here. You'd keep your center of mass underneath you, stacked, and you'd be able to effectively transmit that force up the chain because that pelvis is underneath your upper half. Would you recommend sprinting for a pitcher in the process to gain velo? Touched on this a little bit. The answer is it's not really necessary. It's kind of like it's the supplement equivalent of velocity development from a training standpoint. I know I personally haven't sprinted a long time. I prefer doing some sort of other explosive anaerobic activity that's a little bit lower impact, a little less eccentric stress. So I would prefer to do sled pushes, hill sprints, stair sprints, something where there's not as much of a decelerative impact. An example, downhill sprinting would be the absolute worst thing you could possibly do if you're trying to recover and not use your conditioning as a way to further break down and beat down your body, because that would even magnify the eccentric stress and the impact even more. So I'm looking for, when it comes to like speed work, we're trying to create most of that force and power output in the weight room with different weight exercises and different power exercises, plyometrics, jumping, bounding, things like that, velocity-based training with some of these guys. So sprinting is very far down there on the list, but when we do speed work, it's once or twice a week, and it's low impact the vast majority of the time, like we just talked about. Physicality, okay, we already answered this one. Cues for keeping the front side, we already answered this one. Is long toss a good tool to incorporate in an off-season throwing program? So I don't believe that everybody has to long toss. It is very much dependent on what works for you and your specific mechanics and a couple different variables. Just wrote about this in a throwing resource that we're coming out with soon. So I'll link to that when it does come out. Long toss is a drill. I don't consider long toss velocity training, it's just a throwing drill. Just like if you did a rocker drill at 60 feet to a catcher, or a pivot pickoff at 10 feet into a wall or into a net. It's a drill. It's a drill that I like, and it works for a lot of guys because you have immediate feedback built into it. Because you're able to see the flight path of the ball, you're able to see the spin of the ball. Does it run? Does it cut? I like it as a drill, and it works for a lot of guys that have traditional three-quarter or overhand deliveries. It doesn't work as well for submarine guys. It doesn't work as well for sinker ball guys who are relying on that sinking action. Long toss tends to increase and reward higher arm slot and good ride and good backspin. That's where you get that feedback. When you get good spin and backspin, the ball travels farther, it stays truer on target. So for guys that rely on a ton of movement, ton of sink, I wouldn't necessarily, wouldn't go to long toss as the first thing. And just one cautionary story I'll tell guys, like I played with Chris Sale before in spring training. He came and he did a rehab assignment with our spring training group. And he maybe threw to 110, 120 feet before the game. Low arm slot, little bit of a shuffle step, low effort. His ball's sinking and running. Chris Sale is not a guy who I would encourage to long toss at all. He's figured out what works for him. He came out, he was 96, 98, struck out 13 guys in 5 innings. He's found what works for him, and I think you'd actually make him worse if you gave a guy like that long toss. So it depends. It's a tool, it's a drill. It depends on the guy, and I think it's a fantastic tool for 75, 80% of the guys out there that do have traditional higher arm slot deliveries. How much overhead pressing do you program / think is necessary for pitchers? If you're talking about true overhead pressing, we don't do any barbell overhead pressing. I think getting overhead in some capacity is important for throwers. You are obviously getting overhead. We're overhead athletes, so we need to have the capacity to get overhead in some way or form. A lot of what we're doing is, let's say, upward rotation work, so relatively low loads. For example, serratus wall slides, trying to focus on cueing the serratus how to move properly. Overhead shoulder flexion drills. When it comes to heavier weighted aspects, we're a little bit more, we do more vertical pulling overhead, so something like a chin up or a high to low cable pull would be an example of that. When it comes to pressing, we're a little bit more careful. Landmine press is probably the closest we'll get to overhead. So something like an angled press, we're still getting that upward rotation component, but it's not a true upward movement. A lot of guys just don't have the ability to safely get there. Their scaps don't have the ability to protract and posteriorly tilt to put the shoulder in a good position to get straight overhead. If you try to load them up super heavy, get super aggressive, and just start going at overhead incline bench press or anything like that, you'll just run into a lot of impingement issues with a certain percentage of that population. It's not that everybody on that team is going to get hurt, but if you just throw that type of movement at a team of 35 guys, you're going to have 3, 4, 5 guys that run into issues. Their shoulders just can't get in those positions properly, and eventually it's going to catch up to them. So we're just a little bit more careful on that. I don't think it's entirely necessary to do overhead pressing or even be able to landmine press super heavy for direct velocity development. But you should have the capacity to do a moderate amount of movement or weight overhead without getting any sort of grinding. So the mechanics are more important, but it's not something that we prioritize as much in our training as far as loading. Would you recommend using the Volt app on the App Store for training? I'm not familiar with the workouts on that particular app, but I would be cautious around any program that is not based around what you know are your specific limiting factors. In general, anything that you get that is a general program, even if it is sports specific, if it's not made for you or your specific issues, at best you're getting 75, 85% of the way there towards what you really need in terms of training. If you have perfect movement mechanics, no mobility issues at all, know how to do everything with perfect form, and you just need to build strength, power, whatever, it might be a better fit. If something's designed well but not individualized, it might be a better fit. But most guys that we screen have some sort of issue that they need to work on. And then besides that, just forgetting about that, training is only one small piece of the puzzle. We know it's nutrition, mobility, it's your actual mechanics, your sports-specific mechanics. The training is just, that's 10-15% of the entire pie when it comes to development. Can high caffeine consumption negatively affect tissue quality? So this is interesting question. I'm not aware of any research on this. I'd be surprised if there was some sort of study that showed that caffeine consumption negatively affects tissue quality. What we do know is that dehydrated, if you're chronically dehydrated, you are negatively affecting your tissue quality and your fascia. So it is important to be properly hydrated, or at the very least not be chronically dehydrated. Caffeine can potentially indirectly lead to some dehydration issues if you're just drinking Red Bull all day and you're urinating a ton and you're just not drinking enough actual fluids. So I would be aware of it from that end. More so with caffeine though, I would be concerned with CNS burnout. If you constantly use caffeine as a crutch for poor recovery, that's the real issue. If you're getting used to 5, 6, 7 hour a night of sleep, and you're just using caffeine to mask poor recovery, that's really where the issue is from caffeine consumption. You should be able to not take any caffeine, get good sleep, rely on your recovery habits to come into the gym, feel fresh, feel ready to go. And then if at any point you need caffeine once, twice, 3 times a week to get you that bump above baseline, that's okay. It's when guys are way down below baseline and they're using caffeine just to get back to baseline, that's when you know you have an issue and you need to take a bigger look at, is this just a Band-Aid to a more chronic problem? Thoughts on the VeloPro harness. So I've never used the VeloPro harness, so I can't really comment on my thoughts about it. I am aware, so I like the theory behind it as far as getting into your glute more and feeling your back leg load up. I'm just not aware of anybody that I've directly trained that's used it and their results on it. And I don't come to conclusions of having not tested and tried something myself. That being said, triple extension, which is kind of the opposite of that, where you were trying to fully extend the hip, knee, and ankle. That's not what the hardest throwers in the world do. So keeping a little bit of that bend and load up of the glute on the back leg could potentially be a good idea as far as getting that back knee to rotate down to the ground versus overextend and straighten out into landing. So I like the idea in theory. I have no idea if it works that well in practice, having not tried it. How can I consistently throw the same velocity every time I step on the mound? I wrote a 2-part article series about this and also just presented on this last week. So we sometimes take for granted that big leaguers have such tightly regulated routines and have such consistent performances outing to outing. Like, you pretty much know when you see X, Y, or Z big leaguer, you're going to get a fastball in their specific 2-mile-an-hour range. You pretty much know what you're going to get. Those guys have tightly regulated routines. They've been lifting on the same routine. They've been eating the same way, recovering the same way. They know what works for them, and that's their entire job. That's all they're handling. So those guys tend to be much more consistent. There's so many variables that go into velocity, not just chronic long-term variables like your body structure and your training history, but short-term variables like, did you just run 15 sprints before the game because your coach asked you to? Or did you just crush the lower body the day before? Or did you skip breakfast this day? Or are you overstressed from finals week so you are under-recovered? There's so many variables acutely that come into velocity. I mean, even field conditions, mound conditions, footing. If you have a worn-out cleat, that can affect your ability to create ground reaction forces and throw consistently hard. So there's a lot of variables, and it's trying to learn your routines, learn what works for you. Keeping a journal is an important thing. I think that's going to help. If you're having massive fluctuations and consistency issues, keeping a journal, you're lifting exactly what you did, the schedule over the course of the week, any notes about what didn't work, mechanical cues. You probably have a lot of variability in your mechanics right now if you're seeing giant swings up and down. So again, a hard question to answer, but check out the article series. Guys, if you like this Q&A series, definitely subscribe to us and let us know what you thought in the comments. If you have further questions, definitely keep an eye out. We're going to be running these Q&As on Instagram from here on out. If you have any questions that you absolutely have to get answered and you don't follow us on Instagram, then you can email those questions our way and we'll try to get to them on the next episode. So I'm curious how this is going to go. If it's too long of a format, how you guys are going to like it. But if you didn't like it, let us know, and we're going to continue to take a look at your feedback and give you guys the content that you want to see. So thanks for watching.